I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Welcome, everyone, to Arcane Mark Design Diary Damage Math. This episode is brought to you by people who wanted to see an episode about damage math on previous Arcane Mark episodes. So today, that is what we're going to be talking about. So when it comes to tabletop RPGs, or really most games, there's a significant amount of math that goes in. Now, when we talk about this kind of math, it's not like it's some kind of like college level mathematical analysis proof class like Linda would do back when she was getting her math degree. This is kind of sort of some advanced applications of very basic math that involves statistically analyzing like addition and subtraction and multiplication and kind of those kind of things. Nonetheless, that math can get complicated if you are just kind of going off your gut, in part due to the fact that like evolution encourages us to make decisions that are good for evolution and are not necessarily mathematically good decisions. So in some cases, our gut is like almost ingrained to be wrong about math.
Yeah, I think one of the first things that you'll see, like if you take a class in probability and statistics, are some examples of cases where where people are like, oh yeah, you know, this is what our gut says about how likely something is, but like actually it's totally off.
Yep, that's because if everybody like operated exactly like a probabilistic expectation, then that would be a huge disadvantage, like in terms of like survival overall. So that is why like whatever your gut says about probability is probably not correct. That being said, when we look into the damage math of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, damage math is part of the math, they did the math, that is part of the reason that Pathfinder 2nd Edition scales well up into high levels and allows you to play without it getting completely out of control. I mean, it's not all of why. It's partially math, partially that while some of the spell effects are outrageous, they are less outrageous than some other editions were in terms of just like, oh, it was a high-level spell, you lose the game. And there's numerous other things aside from the math that lead towards this, but the damage math is part of it. And when we talk about the damage math, we have to talk about probability as well.
Yes.
Now,
how likely you are to hit, how likely you are to critically hit, how likely you are to miss or critically miss, that all factors into what the damage math is.
That's true, except the likelihood of critically missing.
Yes.
Usually doesn't.
Usually,
like 99% of the time.
But hitting versus critically hitting versus missing.
Yes. Those are part of the damage math. You can't just look at the damage that a creature deals if it does hit in absentia. That is, in fact, literally a terrible way to build your monsters. And I say this as someone who was a designer on an edition that used to have a monster building guide that told you to do that. By which I mean Pathfinder 1st Edition had the initial monster building guide in the bestiary of Pathfinder 1st Edition had absolutely no distinction between a monster that made attacks at like plus 20, plus 15, plus 10, plus 5 for 30 damage each, and a monster that did a claw, bite, and tail all at plus whatever the highest number I said there, what was it, 20 or 30? All at the highest amount for 30 damage. They were like, oh, that's the same because they went 30 times 4 is 120. This is completely a terrible way to balance your damage math, and it will create you monsters that are very unpredictable in how much damage they do. In fact, Pathfinder 1, Bestiary 1, did not use those numbers. The giants who had, like, decreasing attacks because they had a big weapon they attacked with multiple times did more damage than the amount that was on there. However, after those simplified rules were made, I think a lot of designers used those rules to make the Bestiary 2 through 6 creatures in Pathfinder 1, and that wound up making it so any monster that had attacks with diminishing accuracy returns were just worse than the ones that made lots of claws and bites because it didn't take into account accuracy. So what I'm saying here is you need to take into account accuracy.
Now in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, there's, you know, basically everything is going to have that sort of option to do diminishing. So what matters is that baseline accuracy more so, and that's why you'll see.
But not always.
Yeah. Well, not in the baseline, yes. Well, because you're also going to have special abilities that are going to mess with that. But if you just consider a creature that doesn't have those to start
sure.
with.
But and it is a much higher percentage because in Pathfinder 1, just like anything with claws, it wouldn't decrease if it had like 12 claws. In Pathfinder 2, it's a rare exception when it doesn't decrease, but you need to take those into account. And that's one of the rules that the excellent Building Creatures Guide, I guess, can I call it excellent? Logan and I wrote it. Is that like just self-aggrandizing? I don't know. But people are saying good and useful Building Creatures Guide will give you a lot of tips to calculate damage math of your own monsters. One of the things it does not really warn you about, but that you have to do, and that I've seen fan conversions and other monsters that just use the building guide and don't take this into account fall flat, is that if you are in one of those rare exceptions, so you have a monster and it's like, oh, well, this creature has a double slice like ability, they're both at its highest accuracy, and I'll give it high attack and high damage, but you shouldn't because it has an unusual accuracy situation.
But outside of those unusual situations, some of the more common ones that you'll see are the sort of high accuracy, high damage situation, or the moderate accuracy, extreme damage situation for some of your monsters that are the more like damaged focused monsters. You'll also see the adjustments recommended for if a monster's attacks are agile. That's sort of into the scheme of what if it is more accurate.
Right, but before we get into the weeds with how to balance out the different parts of monsters, like, I'm not actually sure exactly what the people who all wanted to see the damage math wanted to see today, so I'm just going to do everything about the damage math. Fair enough. And so that is very detailed, and I want to start with the big picture. So hopefully I've convinced you that you do need to take accuracy into account. There have been multiple RPGs that are published that don't, or that don't take it into account enough. For example, 5th edition D&D is an improvement over Pathfinder 1st in monster building in that it at least says to take into account the accuracy at all in terms of what you're doing with the damage. But all it does is like pushes it like 1 or at most 2 levels up, even if the accuracy is extremely high, or 1 or at most 2 levels down, even if the accuracy is extremely low, which is better than nothing. And they did say they're going to make a new creature and encounter builder when they do the D&D refresh in 2024 that used to be called 1D&D, so we'll see about that. But hopefully I've convinced you all that we need to take accuracy into account. If I haven't, let's take a look at what accuracy does in Pathfinder 2nd edition, which is even more than it does in those other editions. It was important in all of them unless you've broken the bank and the monster or the PC just hits on a 1, other than if you have a rule that a 1 always misses. So let's suppose that you hit your opponent on a roll of 10. That means you get a critical hit on a roll of 20 in Pathfinder 2nd edition. What that means is, however much damage you do on a hit, let's say that just for sake of argument you do 20 damage on a hit, then you have an 11 in 20 chance, not a 10 in 20, because a 10 in 20 are 50-50 chances if you hit on an 11. You have an 11 in 20 chance of hitting, and on one of those numbers, a 20, you crit for double damage. So your expected damage is 12, because you do, you do 40 damage on a 20, you do 20 damage on everything else down to a 10, and no damage on a 1 through 9. So your expected damage is 12 in that situation. Now, suppose that you use the high accuracy for the monster, or you were a fighter for a PC, and that gave you 2 more accuracy. Now you hit on an 8, and you crit on an 18. Suddenly, I'm doing 40 damage on an 18, 19, or a 20, and I'm hitting on the 8 and 9 that I didn't hit on before. That increases my expected damage from 12 up to 13, 14 from hitting on the 8 and 9, then 15, 16 from the 19 and the 18 becoming critical hits. So that means that my expected damage goes up from 12 to 16. That's by an increase of 1/3 to expected damage. Now that is a local maximum. It's not the most expected damage increase. In fact, the most expected damage increase is probably when you get a +2 to hit, starting from when a 20 exactly
hits.
doesn't
Yeah.
hit, and therefore isn't a critical, and
Yeah.
then the +2 gives you a critical on 20 and a hit on a 19, which triples your damage. Okay, yes, that's better than plus
so
one
it gives
third.
It gives you a better damage boost than many of the numbers.
Most situations that would actually happen in play, other than like attacking on your final attack that's at a -10, out of those, plus 1/6 per point of accuracy, plus 16%, 16.666. It's about as good as you can get, and about maybe 12% on average might be what you expect in the normal zone for a point of accuracy. That's important because accuracy is part of your expected damage, and that's the part of your expected damage that's the hardest for to sort of quantify for most people. But if you think about it that way, it's a little easier to quantify it. So now that we've taken into account how accuracy works, now let's talk a little bit about the damage itself. So when you're looking at a creature's damage...
Are we going to start by taking a look at strike damage, which is by its very nature assumed to be single target damage?
Let's talk about single target strike damage, because that's something that PCs and monsters share the most in common, because it's not on some weird special ability or spell that, like, oh, this PC is a psychic who's doing this amped version of this cantrip, but it's just like, we're doing a strike. How much do we do on a strike? Not a power attack, not like a weird strike that we have, just a normal basic strike. Now, for those of you who are not super familiar for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, a strike is like the basic attack. It's not called an attack action, because then that gets super confusing that one type of an attack is called an attack action. Lots of other editions have that, and it's been one of the biggest head scratchers in every game. So a strike being different, it's just a basic attack. So if you look into how much damage a strike does for a monster, you'll see that the progression goes up basically by about 2 points per level, starting at level 3. It's a little bit different. Like -1 to 1 to 2 go up by 3 each time, and then 0 is kind of like its own little thing, and then after that it goes up by 2 every level beyond that.
Yeah, because those very lowest levels, there's some funky stuff going on with like the hit points and damage and things like that.
That's right. So by virtue of increasing by about 2 for every level beyond that, it goes from 12 at level 3 to 52 at level 24.
Then you're talking here about the high damage.
That's the high
extreme,
damage.
High, moderate, and low.
That's correct. So now the extreme damage compared to the high damage tends to be about 25% more, which also means that sometimes it goes up by 2 damage or 3 damage, depending on the level. Whereas when you're looking at the moderate damage, or actually when you're looking at the low damage is typically 2/3 of the high damage, which means that again, it will not necessarily go up. It'll go up by 1 sometimes, and by 2 other times, but usually by 1, right? Because it's 2/3 of the damage.
And then the moderate damage is in between those two,
it's generally exactly halfway in between.
So it'll often go up by 2, but sometimes by 1.
That's right. So those are the damage progressions for monsters. They're very regular.
How do those compare to the sort of expected damage progressions for PCs?
I'm glad you asked, Linda, because a lot of monster statistics that add to D20 rolls, like attack bonus, armor class, skill modifiers, saving throw modifiers, they tend to be like an optimistic expectation of something that's vaguely in the PC's general direction of what a player character can have. So like the high accuracy is like a fighter's accuracy. That's pretty optimistic. Most PCs can never get a fighter's accuracy, right? But strike the damage for monsters is actually quite low. Very intentionally so. It's quite low. Now, obviously, it goes up steadily, and PC's damage goes up very dramatically at certain levels. So it's not always going to be lower, especially if, like, depending on if your PC's got their striking weapon at level 3 versus level 4.
And things like that,
and so on. But if you look at the steady state increase, PC damage is often quite a bit higher than the monster damage, and that's just for like a basic PC who is just like, yeah, I guess like I'm a wizard. For no adequately explored reason, I am using a +3 major striking flaming shock frost greatsword.
Yes.
I have gained my expert proficiency in it with the Mauler archetype. Why did I do this?
I wanted
I
to.
don't know. I don't know why I did this.
I found this weapon. I thought it was cool.
It seemed like a good idea at the time. I woke up drunk with the Mauler archetype and this greatsword, and I've been using it ever since. Right? So if you ask yourself, how much damage does that character deal? Assuming they don't have any tricks, they don't have any power attack, no other things. It's just this character who has like the basic weapon specialization from being a wizard for +2, 5 from strength. They did at least raise their strength up to 20 because they're doing this weird thing. They did not take a strength apex item either. They still took intelligence, so they did not get 22 strength, right?
Yeah.
So Linda, how do you think that wizard, not fighter who have greater weapon specialization, not barbarian who have rage, how does that wizard stack up to the moderate damage for a monster?
Okay, I'm gonna guess that because you're asking this question, that they're probably just a little bit under it.
Okay, so you think the wizard is going to be just a little bit under. Now, the moderate damage at level 20, because we said level 20 with all those things, for a monster is 37. So, our greatsword does 26 from its 4d12. Its 3 runes puts that up to 36.5. Now, our 5 strength puts that up to 41.5, and our weapon specialization puts it up to 43.5.
Oh, wow.
We are equal to the high damage on that wizard.
Oh wow! Okay, I didn't calculate that. I wasn't expecting that.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
I'm glad we got an unexpected result.
Yeah. Okay. So this is way lower. So
it's way lower.
So how does that interact with what you would expect for the flip side of damage is the way to soak damage, hit points for PCs versus monsters.
Monsters have more. And what this means is that PCs can do some like outrageous things, and the monsters can still survive them. They don't necessarily have a lot more than the highest hit point barbarian, but monsters do tend to have more. So that wizard, that random wizard or automatic bonus progression wizard, as Ninja Noodle calls it, actually does the high monster damage. Now that being said, that wizard is not that far off of the damage of some other characters. Now, let's consider a fighter's damage.
Yeah, because we also need to consider for that wizard though.
Their accuracy is terrible.
I would say if we just took then we would be ignoring accuracy, which is the beginning we said.
Their accuracy is terrible. It is literally like probably 8 worse than a monster that did the same amount of damage, but its damage is the same. Right? Oh no, 6 worse. 6 worse. That's still ridiculously worse.
Does the fact that like the numbers are bigger for PCs, does that have to do with the fact that like players like dealing higher numbers of damage?
They do. They like doing higher amount of damage.
And it's scary to take higher amounts of damage.
Well, plus you can't be sure that they're going to be using a greatsword.
You can't.
So we wanted long swords and shield style and other things like that to be viable. So you don't. So there's another number actually in the numbers that monsters actually don't win against PCs at, which is armor class. They have to go to extreme armor class to be equal to a champion or monk at high levels armor class. Whereas the high is only equal to like non-champion monk marshals. Generally, a monster being high in it means that they're about as good as a top PC for a D20 base number, whereas their damage is lower. Now, the question is, what about a fighter, though? The fighter with 24 strength at level 20, greater weapon specialization, is going to have 8 more damage. It's actually only 8 more damage than the wizard. They also have 6 higher accuracy than the wizard, so it's way more actual damage. But their damage, the fighter's damage would therefore be about 52, which is pretty much, it's closer to extreme monster damage than it is to high, but it is kind of in the middle between those.
So most of the difference takes place in the power of accuracy.
For a fighter.
Yeah.
Now, for a barbarian would have only 4 higher accuracy than that wizard. Now, granted, the wizard could push it to only 3 difference in accuracy with the barbarian if the wizard took an apex strength item.
Yes. But then the wizard has taken an apex strength.
Then the wizard has gone from like being slightly eccentric to like very much weakening their ability to do a bunch of stuff.
Yes.
In order to do this, and so that's fine. And also, only 3 accuracy penalty is a huge penalty. So the barbarian at that level, depending on what their instinct is, will get a huge amount of damage from rage. So let's just take dragon because it's not as much as giant, but it's more than some of the lower instincts because it does like an elemental amount. So that's gonna be 16 from rage. So, compared to the wizard, the barbarian is going to have 4 more from a greater weapon specialization. So, that will compared to the wizard, that will put you to 48. Then, 2 more from strength is 50. And then 16 more, that's 66. Compared to the extreme monster damage, it's above that.
Yeah.
It's significantly above that. And if you're a giant barbarian, it's way above that. In fact, this is higher than the extreme damage for a level 23 monster.
Yeah.
That your barbarian does. It just does. Like, monsters don't actually hit for that much damage. Now, there are, obviously there's always exceptions, right? The level 3 monster that hits for 12 damage because they have a steady progression. If your PCs have not managed to find a striking weapon yet at level 3 when they face this monster, or because it's a 4th level item, and we don't have the monsters jump immediately by they go up by 6 at level 4, that would cause problems with mixed monster builds. So because it's an in-between, the amount of damage it deals is about as much as it's a little bit more than just like the wizard with a great sword and strength, or even the fighter with the great sword and strength deals. If it's not striking, it's way less than a striking weapon, though.
So when considering like these tables and like the times that the PCs get like a better level of a striking rune, and then like in classes when they get like more proficiency in their weapons and things like that, did you guys like compare that against or work with that in the cadence of the monster chart to be like, okay, we're gonna get a proficiency
the monsters don't try
to
follow the PCs in lockstep because that makes people frustrated. Instead, they have a steady progression that goes where it wants to go at the end, which means that you have a lot of fun chaos. Chaos that people find fun, where suddenly your PC got a huge thing and they're just way ahead of the curve now, and the curve slowly catches back up to them.
Yeah.
But it does also lead to situations where you fought a monster that's several levels beyond, and
that's
they're ahead of the curve and not you. Because especially if you are a level where you're about to get a large increase, but you don't have it, and the monster is several levels beyond, because then you don't have the advantage of that thing that would have put you slightly ahead. You're slightly behind.
So it creates a natural fluctuation of like easier levels and harder levels.
Yes, that's correct. But what's very, very important...
I like asking questions I know the answer to.
Yes, it's very, very important is to look into that damage when people are like, monsters are just better than PCs at doing at like being damagers all around. Well, not really when it comes to the amount of damage that they deal on their strikes. Their accuracy is great. It's fighter or gunslinger accuracy. It is the highest in the game with high. And if you some reason give your monster an extreme accuracy, which at some levels you do, at those levels, that's where PCs are having like weird buffs and heroism and aiding with the critical success for circumstance bonuses or whatever. But the monster does have like with an extreme accuracy higher than any PC could have just sitting around in a chair sipping a martini.
Yeah, and when the PCs get to higher levels, they're gonna have a larger toolkit in a lot of ways. So in the same way that when you're building an NPC, you're not going to necessarily go in there and say, yes, well, I'm going to choose all of the skill feats and all of the other widgets you do. You just pick the most impactful things. So PCs are generally going to be more versatile, and that's going to help give them the edge as well.
Correct.
Over monsters.
So when you have a monster with high attack and high damage, which is the sort of suggested fighter roadmap for a monster, they actually do lower damage than like the damage dealing fighters, like a greatsword fighter most of the time. And when you have the barbarian-esque brute build, moderate attack, extreme damage, like Linda was mentioning before, they actually do less damage than a barbarian. But they do have the same accuracy as a barbarian, just like the high attack, high damage have the same accuracy as a fighter. And so that's important to take into account, like especially if you're someone who likes to throw PC based builds at your PCs as an opposition, is that that barbarian you built like a PC actually does more damage than anything that even than the extreme that you would have put in before going into stuff like power attack or other special abilities.
Yes.
Now, like we said earlier on, you want to take into account not just your accuracy on the first attack, but how your accuracy moves throughout your attack routine. For that reason, the agile weapon trait suggests to move down one category of damage from high to moderate when you're using an agile weapon. Now, is that like a little bit of an overcorrection for how much it helps to have agile? Yeah, it is. But if you don't take into account those better accuracy on the later attacks, then it makes it so that that people with agile weapons are just better than the ones without agile weapons. And of course, if you have a way to not take a penalty on the later attacks, like a double slice making 2 attacks at the same bonus, you have to take that into account.
Yes.
So let's just get putting in our favorite example before of hitting on a 10, especially since actually if you hit on an 8 and then your attack that's at a penalty will lose more from this. So you actually lose relatively little from hitting on a 10 compared to what you lose from hitting on an 8 and then take a -5. When you hit on a 10 with 20 damage, your expected damage, we said before, is 12. If you then take a -5 to that, right, that on your next attack, then your expected damage would be reduced from 12 to 7. So that's not quite reducing it by half, right? And then if you took another -5 after that, well, that's not good. In that case, your expected damage is reduced to 2. Basically, you crit on a 20, barely, and then you miss on everything else. That's what it is. So that you probably shouldn't even attempt to roll that. Now, if you had a -4, what happens? Well, in that case, your expected damage is reduced from 16. Not from 16. Sorry, we start from 12. It's reduced from 12 to 8. And is reduced from 8 to 4. So if you started with 20, so you can see that's especially a big advantage on the later attacks because 8 is certainly a lot better than 7, and 4 is way better than 2. I mean, it's double. So obviously, if you reduce the damage by like about 1/6, like it goes from high to moderate, then usually that means that those agile attacks on the second attack are still, maybe their expectation is a little worse. But that's what's going on the third attack, they're way better, and that's what's going to bring me into my next point, which is after I spent all of this time telling you that you really, really need to take into account accuracy, and you do, do not. And you do need to do that, and you're going to be ahead of the game of multiple editions that told you, oh, just look at the damage. If you do use expected value calculations like I've been discussing here, do not, like, sort of bow down just single-mindedly at the altar of expected value damage calculations, because expected value damage calculations can lead you astray. And the reason why they can lead you astray is because they don't take into account the parity of how much damage you need to actually deal to the creature in order to defeat the creature, and they don't take into account reliability of your attacks in the situation. To give a perfect example of this, at one point I was considering making a joke class called the Playtester class that would have a bunch of different like feats and options, and some of them would have like the trap trait, which is normally a trait on hazards to say that it's a trap, but these would be trap feats that were meant to trap you, and they were built for each type of playtester. And there's one trap for each of the subclasses, and one of the subclasses was the math playtester, who's always running White Room math simulations. And their trap feat was called, like, I can't remember what it was called. It was like Omega Strike or something like that. Here's what it did. It was called Omega Strike. It's one action. Is make a strike. If your strike is a success, or if your strike would be a hit, roll a D100. On a result of 100, your strike does 1,000 times the usual damage. On any other result, your strike fails. So, if you're using expected value calculations, the reason why it's a trap feat for the math subclass is because if you're using a White Room expected damage chart, and you'll see these tables online in a lot of analyses, and they're good. They help a lot, but on that, it would just be way above everything else. It would just like always use Omega Strike because the expected value is actually 10 times higher. But it's unplayably bad because 99% of the time you don't do anything.
Yeah. To give a less extreme example of something where you have like situational damage coming in, one of the classic ones is sneak attack, where you balance for that by having the damage be, you know, low to moderate without sneak attack or extreme with the sneak attack damage, because you know, okay, well, there's more damage that comes in, but it's not 100% of the time. So it's okay to have it be extreme because it's not going to be 100% of the time, but you also don't want it to go beyond that because it's going to be...
Those are usually paired with moderate accuracy, so it's more of a like, well, we kind of expect you'll probably get the sneak attack because, well, we let barbarians be moderate and extreme anyway. But yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Another way that you can get sort of fooled by that, let's assume that the monster actually had enough hit points that you needed to roll 1,000 times damage against it, and not all that was wasted. Omega Strike would still be a really bad idea. But the reason it's even worse is actually that most of that damage will be wasted because you don't need to do 1,000 times damage. And that still applies to many typical situations that you might find in a fight without a, like, jokishly created, like, devil's advocate feat like Omega Strike. So, for example, suppose that you're, like, a barbarian and you're in range and you've been attacking with your great axe, and you know, the enemy used ferocity, and so you absolutely know that they have 1 hit point.
Yes.
Okay? So, because they used ferocity, they definitely have 1 hit point. And, you know, your first level barbarian, what should you do? Well, you look at your sheet and it says, well, my great axe in rage does, you know, 1d12 plus 10. My fist does 1d4 plus actually only 7 because my rage is halved. My expected damage with my greatsword is 16.5, and my expected damage with my fist is only 9.5. And yeah, sure, my accuracy is 2 higher on the fist, but it's almost twice as much damage on the great axe. I should keep rolling the great axe, right? Well, no, because you only need to do 1 damage and going down. All the rest of the damage is wasted. So in a lot of cases, big, low accuracy, high damage hits can wind up having some of their damage wasted, and so their effective actual damage is lower than you think. Whereas higher accuracy, smaller damage hits wind up providing more actual damage. And that's one reason why monsters with agile attacks can wind up being a good deal, even if the expected damage is a little bit lower.
Yeah, because it's then easier for them to, say, take down one opponent and then switch to the next one with an attack that's more accurate than it would have been otherwise.
So Nin the Noodle is wondering how to compare a multiple action ability to a 3-strike routine. You have to take into account how the multiple attack penalty will apply. So I showed you there, if they hit on exactly a 10, that if you did 3 strikes with 20 damage, you would do 12, then 7, then 2, which would be a total of expected damage of 21. Obviously, that 2 is like hidden in a roll of 20 for 40, otherwise do nothing. So if you were instead going to give 3 attacks that were at the full attack bonus, right, then you would want the attacks to do less than half as much damage. If they did, or around half, maybe at most. If they did 10 instead of 20, then you would expect... no, wait a minute. Did I get that wrong? No, slightly over half. That's right. Because if they did 10 instead of 20, they would do 6 each time, and that would be a total of 18, which is slightly less than a 21. So you can do a little bit more than 10, but you would have to reduce the damage by a lot. This is also why almost no monsters have an ability that says make 3 strikes against the same target and do not reduce your multiple attack penalty.
What about a more common type thing where it's like, you know, here's a 2-action activity that deals damage?
So if you have a multi-action activity that deals damage, you should take into account exactly what the opportunity cost is and what is being moved away. To continue with our 10 example, and it is by no means the only accuracy, right? Because if you hit on an 8, like we said before, then with 20 damage, you'd be doing 16, and taking that -5, suddenly you hit on a 13, and your damage is only like...
You're going from an 8?
You're going from 16 down to like 9, so it loses nearly half. It loses even closer to half than when you were at 10, right? So the second one is like only half as good as the first one in that case. So basically, if you're doing a 2-action attack that also counts as 2 attacks for your multiple attack penalty, very important, because the third, that'll determine what happens with the third attack. You're kind of replacing making 2 attacks in a row. And that means in a lot of cases that all else being equal, you probably want to not be doing that much more than 50% more damage, or you're going to be doing way too much damage.
Yeah.
And that also makes it very strong option against resistance. Even if it's doing less than that, it's good against resistance compared to 2 attacks. It's good in terms of... it's good if you need burst damage against healing. It's good if you have a way to boost 1 attack, such as the aid action or True Strike. So there's numerous reasons why you wouldn't want to make it do the same expected damage as the multiple attacks do, because of the fact that... Oh yeah, also your chance of doing all of the damage is higher, because with the 2 attacks you'd have to hit with both to do all of the damage.
Unless you have a thing where it's like hit and then like there's a saving throw involved as well, that can mitigate it somewhat.
Yes, that's right. So you're going to want to do somewhat less than 50% more damage if you want to make it work out in that case. So, let's see. Nin the Noodle in chat made a spell that did 1d100 damage. If you rolled 100, it blew up the region. Yeah, so, I mean, that's kind of like the Omega Strike feat.
I think it's funny because it's like, it could be, it's less like the Omega Strike in that it always does at least something.
Yes, that's true.
And also, like, the roll 100, blow up the region is funny because it's just like, well, who's going to be the one to risk to cast this spell, right? So what we've been talking about so far is, we've been talking about single target effects.
That's correct. We've been talking about strikes and attacks this entire time.
Yeah.
Now, there is another, damage table, but it's a little bit squidgier than the strike damage because of the fact that it is the area damage table, but it also is just kind of like, these are area damage for a 2-action activity that does damage in an area, and the area is appropriate for its level, whatever that means.
Yeah.
So, what that does wind up meaning is if you're like level 20 and it's a 15-foot cone, it can probably do more than that, because that's not a very appropriate area for its level. In a lot of cases, what happens with spells and effects is they get a more impressive area, but they don't scale up that much above area damage. It's a better choice than making that 15-foot cone that just is death as a spell, because of the fact that, well, you know, it stops it from being a swinging glass cannon situation.
Where it's either super effective or it doesn't do anything. Exactly. It's better to have something that's more versatile than something that's more situational.
Yes. So, when you look at those area damage, it has limited use, which is generally like, you know, once per day, or, you know, it's on a 1d4 round timer.
Yeah, 1d4 round timer is one of the classic ones, like, you know, a dragon's breath or things like that.
Limited use generally does not include something that's like, oh, you know, they can only cast it 3 times.
Yeah,
because that's be like, well, okay, they could do it all 3 of their first 3 rounds.
So it's more like limited parentheses within the scope of this combat. You're not going to see it more than once or maybe twice.
You might see it twice, but if you do, probably not twice in a row. And so limited use is generally goes up by about 3.5 damage, except for, once again, -1 to 1 is counted as 1 step, and the 0 is like, I'm in the middle, just like with everything else.
Yeah.
So, you know, it goes 4 to 7 to 11 to 14 to 18. It basically goes up by 1d6 every level except for the 0 is kind of weird, and -1 to 1 goes up by 1d6.
Yeah.
And then the limited area damage is exactly half of the unlimited damage.
Or the unlimited is
that's what I mean.
around,
The
yes.
unlimited is exactly half of the limited damage. Yes, that's what I mean. The one
Mm-hmm.
that you can just use all the time is half damage.
And unlimited then is, it's not, it's like Mark said before, this is kind of assuming that it's a 2-action thing. If you had something that you could just use every single action, then you would need to pull that back further.
Oh yeah, way back.
So when you're doing those kinds of abilities, though, generally having them be 2 actions is a good call.
I would suggest it. And also, just like even spells kind of meet with this. So, for example, like a level 20 unlimited use effect for 2 actions is 33, and like electric arc or one of those spells does like 32 without any other things adding to it at level 20. In fact, telekinetic projectile, which is only single target and requires a spell attack roll, does more damage than that.
So I just saw a question in chat that's one of the key considerations when calibrating damage too is balance for spells like Daze that have low damage but can impose a condition.
So, I would suggest subtracting some percentage of the damage for that, and or if you're like, no, I must have a 15-foot cone at level 20, then consider instead of giving it's like, well, I guess I could just shoot the damage up into the stratosphere. Consider instead of doing that, giving it a condition to sort of make up for the fact that it has a really bad area for its level, because if you shoot the damage up into the stratosphere, that's not really very fun for your players. It's like, well, you shouldn't have gotten in this 15-foot cone. Now it does 150 damage instead of 75.
Yeah. It also depends on the intensity of the condition itself. A more minor negative condition is going to be worth less. It's going to be worth a smaller amount of damage than a more major condition.
Of course. So something like keeping you out of the fight is going to be worth a lot, or maybe all of it. Nin the Noodle is wondering if the tables are somewhere. They're all in the Building Creatures tables from the Game Mastery Guide. Game Mastery Guide is brought to you by Paizo. It is written by Logan Bonner and Mark Seifter, as well as any other authors who helped contributed some of the articles and a lot of those NPCs. Plus Linda.
Yeah.
And Linda wrote some hazards, and like Ron wrote some sections to it, and Eleanor wrote some curses. There's a lot of good fun. You could find it wherever your Paizo stuff is not sold out due to everyone buying it.
Yes.
Basically, what you're looking at for area damage is, it's not like the area damage table is a be-all, end-all. It's like all effects do exactly this damage, but it's more of a, like, try to find a way in your heart to make it do this much damage, or less if it does conditions and has a big area, because if you really make it do more damage than this, it can wind up causing problems, especially if it's encountered in multiple. Like, if you think, okay, sure, 74... You're saying, Mark, don't do 150 instead of 74 on my 20th level monster and make it a small area, but surely I can, because at 20th level, like, even a wizard at 20th level probably has, like, 250 hit points. It could survive 70... It can survive 150, even on a failure, unless it critically fails. It's like, sure, but... Your 4 20th level PCs might face 3 of this.
Yes.
And if it shoots 3 15-foot cones and they happen to have been in the 15-foot cone for 450 damage, then suddenly your wizard, who succeeded all 3 reflex saves, is still unconscious.
Yeah, because created monsters are generally balanced to allow them to work in a variety of situations. You may... maybe if you just have this is a unique one-off monster, and I know there's never going to be more than one of these in my campaign, then you'd be okay with that. But the design principles are generally designed for flexibility in that regard.
That's right. So, Nin the Noodle wonders if high-level and low-level feats have damage bonus equivalence tables. They do not. Just... You can look at those feats and special abilities, and you have to make decisions for them based upon what their levels are. In general, it's more interesting to give abilities that give a wider variety of effects, options, or capabilities than it is to just try to like burst up your damage per round expectations. And very few feats, but some do that kind of thing where it's just like, well, this action just does way more damage than everything else, and you got it at 14th level, and it's just a triple damage attack. That's not very common, but you will find ways to, like...
Aren't the most common damaging feats like feats that give you a spell that you can cast once per day?
I mean, you can get stuff like that, but you can get things that are that save you actions and compress your actions down.
And then the lower levels, the ones that give you, like, oh, I now have a claw attack or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Ninja Noodle says, I'm honestly amazed by how much of PF2 seems to have been done by Phil, considering how balanced it is. Well, you can... if you know the system enough, you can tell when something is going to go out of balance, and you can look at each individual component and run a mathematical analysis. Just because I can't tell you how to build something on your own without saying do it by feel doesn't mean I need to do it by feel.
Yeah, because it would be like, oh yeah, I know I want to do this one, so I'm gonna make a spreadsheet and look at a bunch of different cases. What happens if I hit on this accuracy, or what happens, or how does this compare to these other options that are already in the game?
That's correct. I'm a huge optimizer myself, and therefore I can find and remove and make sure it doesn't get into the game things that are going to cause an issue, because I'll see it and be like, oh yeah, I would break the game half open with this.
Yeah, I find
that's kind of one of my specialties, and running those numbers, figuring things out, and that's one of the things I did for 2nd edition, was to make sure that things like that didn't make it into the game.
Comparing things to existing effects, paying attention to what the niche of each class is. So if you have something that's more one class's deal, you're not giving something that's that powerful to another class, because that's that class's deal. Taking a look at the kinds of things that spells can do to figure out at what levels certain conditions might to start to come online. Noting that if something only happens on a critical failure, that's important that only happens on a critical failure.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's how you can sort of figure things out.
I tend to look at spells when I'm thinking, wait a minute, how much is this condition worth? I might say, okay, yeah, well, here's a spell, and it applies this condition and does this much damage, whereas here's another spell that just does damage of that level. How much was that condition counted for?
Exactly. And so that's why I can't just tell you something other than just kind of look at it and make it work, because each individual, there's not just because I'm saying that you need to do it that way doesn't mean that it's all art and that there's no science, but the science is not formulaic, your IRS tax spreadsheet where it's like, oh, well, this is your income, therefore this is your amount that's owed on income tax. It's actually much more dynamic and requires you to look at it in a very interesting way while still being a science and an art. So since the science is different each time, unfortunately, if you don't go really deep into it, you kind of can't do those science things just on your own, and that's okay. Ninja Noodle says the bounce was done by iteration. Then sort of, but not exactly. There are ways to do it without having to go through a lot of iterations. There are ways to analyze, but you have to analyze things individually. So you can think of it as isolation testing. You can think of it as, in some cases, it was iteration, right? Or a vertical slice that then expands outwards using certain baselines.
So how you had the starting few classes, and then you got those to work well amongst each other, and then you added other classes to compare to that baseline.
Right, and if you're talking about damage math, which we are here in this episode, then that all started from some fundamental questions that we had, that we just discussed as an entire team of how many turns to do something cool do we want your character to have on average in a fight before the fight is over? And that kind of determines where hit points and damage and all those things should start, because if you want that answer to be on average 0.25, like it is in many Pathfinder 1st edition games, your character gets 0.25 turns because there are 4 people in the group, each of whom will win the fight on their first turn. So each fight you get a quarter of a turn, because if you went, well, maybe that's not true, because the Foresight Diviner got 90% of the turns and the rest of the people split the other 10%. But you get what I'm saying. Whereas if you didn't want that, then that tells you a lot of things about, first of all, what you have to do to the incapacitation effects in the game to make sure that that doesn't still happen every time in the first round. What you have to do with damage, and it actually just, that single high level mathematical decision has huge rippling ramifications throughout the system.
There's another major chart that's operating in the background that determines the scaling rate here too, and that's the rules for how much XP monsters are worth based on their level. So the fact that you want it to be the case that, say, you know, a monster when you are a level 1 monster when you're level 1 gives you 40 XP, but then that's the same amount of XP that you would get from 2 level 1 monsters if you were level 3.
That's right.
Making sure that making sure that things hit hard enough and do the right amount of damage to keep that whole thread going.
2 level 1 monsters being equal to 1 level 3 monster. Now, that's something that Pathfinder 1, 3.0, 3.5 D&D all claimed to be true. It was not really true in those editions. I mean, I think they were trying to make it true. It was a very interesting mathematical progression, but it meant that the creatures needed to have an effective power level of like twice as much as a thing 2 levels lower. Pathfinder 2, I feel, really actually does that, and they're quite close to being twice as strong if they're 2 levels higher. Of course, that means a monster 2 levels higher is very strong, and it does that through a combination of non-linear combination of effects that are themselves sort of somewhat linear, right? Like we saw the damage. If we're just doing high damage each time, it's going up by 2.
Damage goes up,
and so
you've got
certainly
your AC going up.
Certainly, if I'm a level 16 monster did 4 more damage than a level 14 monster, and like the starting amount was obviously pretty high, right? So it didn't double the damage. It didn't even come close to doubling the damage, right? 14 monster did 34. A 16 monster does actually 37. It's one of the few levels where it doesn't go up by 4 because there's a 3 in there. So let's instead do a 13 and a 15. 32 goes up to 36. That's only plus 1/8 to damage. But we got plus 1/8 to damage. Maybe we got about a third to damage by virtue of accuracy. Yeah. And so, like...
And our AC went up, so we're not going to be getting hit as often. The same thing with our saving throws. We're going to survive longer for having more hit points.
We can therefore do more things before we get more turns. So by having 33% more accuracy for damage from accuracy and 1/8 more damage from damage, while we 50% more damage on each turn, then we get more turns before we're killed than one of those individual creatures does. So when you put it all together, it works out pretty well. Just like it's a weird scientific mathematical like sort of Frankenstein equation that makes the monsters kind of work out like that. Alright, so I feel like we have talked about all the different kinds of damage math in the game. Is anybody who is watching interested in any other questions about damage math, especially if you were one of the people who asked us to talk about damage math? Did we talk about the damage math you were interested in? Let us know in the chat, and I will give a brief moment for that to occur. Let me see. So we talked about PC damage versus monster damage, strike damage, area and spell damage. So obviously it's something to take into account, right? Like I'm working on the Elemental Avatar class right now, and that is a class that usually is spending 2 actions to do some like big elemental effect, which makes me think of things in terms similar to that 2 action area damage. And in fact, I use the 2 action area damage a lot to try to figure that stuff out. So Tony says, I was told that lightning is usually D12 die. So that is true. It's one of the things about lightning is that like when I was putting in some of the lightning effects, just there were some weird things I did with dice, some of which were not good and we did not keep. But one of the things was putting D12s on lightning, and people kind of like that as it being the very variable one compared to like fire kind of just being more, okay, it's D6s, you roll more of them.
Or like force being D4s, which not just because it kind of gets through stuff, but also because it's...
And not always, but sometimes. Now, I will say that using D12s is actually a huge pain. and it leads to massive problems where it's like you can only move things by 6.5. So you wind up with a situation where it's like, yeah, Sudden Bolt, the 8 Adventure Path spell from that early Adventure Path, is probably overpowered compared to other spells of its level. You can decide whether you think that all spells should be raised up to an amount of that, but it certainly does more than any of them. But if it did a D12 less, it would be
way too little,
like really low, and it would be like a 3rd level Sudden Bolt would be the same as Lightning Bolt, but not a line.
Yeah.
And it's just because 6.5 is a massive amount, especially at lower levels, and so there's no good thing to do with it. And
unless you were able to put like a plus on all of them.
That's something that definitely is something I had to take into account with the electric element in the elemental avatar, and it does not use D12s for everything because they're just does not give you room to maneuver. So X Noskulks says early levels have large damage comparative to your health, while high levels have damage be lower compared to your health. Does this give higher levels a more epic feel? Well, we could have given lower levels about the same amount of damage compared to your health, but it is true, like, that, there are different design philosophies when it comes to different levels and sort of feels, and like Jason Bowman, the director of game design at Paizo, really, really likes the feel at low levels of being fragile and like you can just go down or be killed by a lucky critical hit at any moment. He likes to write adventures that are very challenging, and that I've always liked playing in the adventures he wrote because I like the kind of Dark Souls-y type, like, oh, this is really hard. This is going to push me to my limit. I have to think hard to beat these adventures. Even since Pathfinder 1st Edition, he wrote some really good ones that I like. But it does mean that one thing about that decision is it makes it more off-putting to new players than if you decide to have low levels also take more hits to take you down.
So if you look
closely,
it's a trade-off. So if you look closely at like what lower level Pathfinder Society scenarios do, for example, they will like specifically avoid some of the things that would be the most deadly, like the simple hazards that have a really high punch or things like that. In order because that new player
that was an early lesson.
Yeah.
Like the very first adventure for Pathfinder 2nd Edition had a simple hazard that just did the high damage, and because it was new. As the design lead, I was looking through all of them at the time, and I made a note on it that I said, turn some of this to persistent damage or something so that it can not be all in direct damage, because this has a pretty decent chance of just one shot insta-killing someone.
And doesn't some of it have to do, too, with the fact that, like, D4 is the smallest die that you have, so like, past a certain point, like, if you're going to do D4 plus 1 damage, like, you can't go that much smaller than D4.
Yeah, it's a significant issue, and it's one that those die size things, we talked about it with the D12s, right? But even a D4 is sometimes too big. And sometimes the kind of math expressions you can use in a tabletop RPG compared to like a video game just mess you up. Here's a good example of that. In the playtest, many people may not remember this, but Electric Arc just did less damage than the other cantrips did because it hits 2 targets with reflex. Like, people are like, dude, the designers know that Electric Arc hits 2 targets with reflex? Yes. It should do a little bit less damage, but there is no expression for that little bit less damage that exists because we had all the cantrips go up, like, every 2 spell levels in the playtest. It was miserable because you had to wait from level 1 to, like, level 5 for it to go up. And at level 4 and 3, you were like, this is terrible. So we standardized it so most of them, except for the very lowest ones, like Daze was still a little lower than Electric Arc, right? The very lowest ones still go up at that rate, but the second category, there had to be a breakpoint at some point, and the breakpoint was on Electric Arc. That was like, okay, this is the first one that doesn't go up at level 5, and that caused it to be just, a little bit better than all of the other ones that also got to be collapsed to the same damage number because there was no expression they could take. Because the difference between 1d4 per spell level and 1d6 per spell level is the difference between 32 and 42 at higher levels. It's like a third more damage.
Makes a huge
It's a
difference.
massive amount more. And so, yeah, it's absolutely true, Linda, that what you were saying, that even a d4 is bigger than you think, especially at low levels. And when you stack up the D4s, they get bigger than you think at high levels. Because there's no expression you can make that goes up every 2 levels and is like what you would want there that's with dice. D3s don't exist in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. You could be like, Electric Arc does exactly 2 damage per spell level plus your key ability score. That way it goes up to, 27 instead of 32. But, like, who wants to roll 2 damage?
Yeah, I think, I personally prefer the ones that are like, so some dice and then some bonus to the ones that are like, here's a giant mitt full of dice. Like, sometimes it's fun to roll a giant mitt full of dice, but I also like the greater reliability of the some dice and then some bonus, both in terms of like your PC's not gonna have a stinker turn, and also like your monster's not gonna roll really high and wipe people.
Absolutely. Actually, that's a reason. Another thing to talk about the damage math is the average that sort of the like. I'm going to read this dice expression right off the table from Game Mastery Guide. Tries to give a good mix of dice plus modifier for exactly the same reason. And I know that's something that Pathfinder lead designer Logan Bonner is very deliberate about, is wanting to have there be a dice expression and a damage amount that are relatively balanced, so that, for the reasons that Linda was saying. So, let's see. People in chat are discussing some things about, like, not adding ability modifier when you're attacking 2 targets with electric arc. The problem with that is at first level, it makes attacking 2 targets just worse by a drastic amount, right? Because you could do 2.5 to 2 things, or you could do 6.5 to 1 thing. 6.5 to 1 thing is way better than 2.5 to 2 things. So yeah, there's a lot that you have to think about, and it's actually just like... It's actually interesting because a lot of people are like, well, electric arc should have been fixed. How did they not know to do it differently? And it's just like, well, what do you do with it, right? Like, assuming that you agree that cantrips are at the right amount. I know some people want cantrips to be like, well, why don't cantrips go up to like D12s for? And so they do. What would that be if you had a D12 each one? 72 at level 20. And be a little more competitive with, like, a marshal making 2 attacks at that level. But, like, assuming that you wanted cantrips to have the power level that they do roughly on average, it's actually not quite so simple. And there are some complicated expressions you can do. Like I said, you could also do one that was just pure damage, that was just, like, first level, ability modifier plus 2. Third level, add another 2. But there's just a lot of trickiness that can come into those kind of damage expressions where dice kind of get in your way.
So Mark and I are playing a game now where we don't have those like kinds of rounding and simplifications where it's just like, yes, this doesn't. Each time you rank up your spell power, your thing does 1.5 times as much damage. So we have things where it's like, yeah, this does 88.1273578 something damage.
Linda has one spell in the game that I wrote that, let's see, it does 136.6875, but when the day is elementally attuned to that element, it does 148.078125.
Yes.
So you can see that that's not very tenable for most people to use, right?
Yes.
You would tear out your hair probably if you had to do that.
But it's like, it's technically it is technically more balanced and we can work with it, but I think it also goes to show like why games generally put those kinds of simplifications in, because we can enjoy it and just say, okay, we're just gonna pay attention to the base numbers, and if it's super close, we'll go back and figure out what all the little ones were, and if they popped it over into knocking this person out or whatever. But
Ezekiel is wondering what a key balancing point might be between a saving throw effect and a spell attack roll effect. Well, you'd want to give it a little something extra on a spell attack roll effect, right? Like if you look at cantrips, the spell attack roll ones are more damage than everybody else, or like melee or range flexibly, so you can flank if you want, but also attack at range, or super longer range than all of the other cantrips, and a lot of spells that aren't cantrips.
Yeah.
So they and some of those also do like some weird thing on a critical hit. So they generally do a little more due to that fact. Now, obviously, Electric Arc, which was originally did less damage, also does a little more, and now does not do less damage, but that is just kind of a thing that happens when damage math. A reality of tabletop RPGs is that there's only a certain number of expressions you can use for damage math.
And you want to make it easy for the players generally to pick it up and use it.
Yep. Ultimately, some things that I would love to do with math have to be sacrificed on the altar of this would be like impossible to play, and it's way more fun if you use an expression people can actually use. Those are good additional questions, everybody. I hope everyone enjoyed this Mathapalooza for our very last episode ever of Arcade Mark in this apartment.
Yes.
And we will see everyone here on the 29th in a new location.
Let's say goodbye to YouTube.
Let's say goodbye to YouTube. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye.